Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is January the 11th, 2016. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics tonight. We're going to try to touch on the foreign policy issue, try to touch on Syria. We'll try to touch on, again, Hillary Clinton, maybe even Bill Gates. We've got some physics stuff to discuss. And, of course, I want to touch on the latest things that have been in the news, the Obama gun control plan, and the Bundy standoff in Oregon. We've got a lot of interesting things to say about that, so stay tuned. Also, hopefully we want to have enough time to discuss the way forward in 2016, which we've been talking about since the beginning of the year, and I want to continue talking about that. But before we do, I want to encourage anybody who's a new listener. You can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. If you're interested in my work, you can follow it at activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, and brandonturbeville.com. In fact, if you're interested in my work specifically, then I would encourage you to go to brandonturbeville.com and follow it there. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show, and all of the other relevant information, right? It's all posted there, and you can go to the Books tab, find all the books. There's even a free book available on the website, The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. It's available for free, and there's also an events page as well. So make sure you stop by brandonturbeville.com on a daily basis because the site is updated regularly. Now, what do we want to talk about in terms of the way forward in 2016? Because we're going to get into more detail about this as we go forward in the year. Last week, I was suggesting to all of the listeners, and the week prior to that we need leaders, and we need people to build coalitions. And thankfully, I've seen some response to that, and I've actually seen some action in that direction. So I'm glad to see that. Of course, we need more. We always need more. But the idea was that whatever the issue you're looking at, whether it's gun rights, whether it's natural health, whether it's economics, whether it's peace and war avoidance, the goal is to bring as many individuals and as many groups together that share your ideas and ideals and form a coalition. You don't all have to like each other. You don't all have to agree with one another. In fact, in most cases, you probably won't do either. But it doesn't matter because you need to be a group of individuals, not just a group, not just a mass, but you need to be a collection of individuals who have come together for the same purpose, which means whether it's guns, vaccines, economics, health, whatever, peace, all of that stuff, you need to develop a program. Remember, in order to demand something, you have to know what it is that you are demanding. So you need to get some demands. You need to get a program. You need to get all this stuff together. And we're going to be talking about that hopefully in the next few weeks, going through the program in a detailed fashion. Once you get that program together, you can then reach out to other organizations. And as I mentioned before, the way this works is you have a program, but generally speaking, what's going to get the most groups involved is the weakest part of your platform, right? The most watered down part of your platform. That's fine, because what you need to do is take that most watered down part of your platform and use that as the spearhead to get these other groups of individuals behind you to actually get that accomplished. That's a step forward, and then you can move on to the second most watered down part of your platform and get that going as well. It's a gradual process of moving forward and getting agendas and achieving goals, getting agendas through and achieving goals. So that's what we need to do. Now, in order to bring these groups together, it needs more than simple posts online or chatting about it. What you need to do is you get your program, you get ideas set up in the method that you need them to be set up. In other words, the most watered down version part of your platform down to the most radical, most revolutionary part of your platform. And you start contacting groups. You get in touch with individuals of like minds, and this is what you need to do first to get as many people to help you as you can. But you need to be the coalition builder. You need to be the leader. So you get as many people together to try to do this as possible. And then you reach out to other groups and get as many of these groups as possible to join your coalition, right? Your united front. You can have initially a defensive posture, but you need to have an offensive posture as well, which means we can't just fight against mandatory vaccines. We can't just fight against gun laws. We have to fight for greater freedoms for people to be able to choose about vaccines, which means not only do we want mandatory vaccine laws to be eliminated, but we also don't want to have to sign exemption forms, right? That's an offensive posture, because if there's an exemption form, we have the ability to sign the exemption form and not take a vaccine. But we shouldn't have to do that, because that's not up to the state to bully people into taking vaccines. So we'll get rid of the exemption forms, right? That's the offensive strategy. And this applies to all the other, the economics, the peace strategies, all of this as well. So whatever your issue is, you need to reach out to the groups in your area, in your city, in your county, in your state, and then move nationally and bring people together on this coalition and link people up. And hopefully once we get this done, we'll be able to link these various groups together. Not all of them certainly, but bring many of them together on some of the similar issues and create an even bigger coalition. But we need you to do it. And whatever you are working toward, you can even do this simultaneously on other issues, but whatever you're working toward, you need to bear in mind that the groups that you're going to talk to and the individuals that you're going to talk to may not believe the same way you do on everything. In fact, they may not agree with you at all on anything other than the one issue, and that's fine. It takes all kinds of people, and you're going to have to just work with people that you don't agree with. They're going to annoy the hell out of you sometimes. They're going to bother you. But you're just going to have to build this coalition. Again, I go back to the example of Martin Luther King, who fought for civil rights, who was making a tremendous effect. But it wasn't until he started linking the civil rights movement with the labor movement, with the anti-war movement, that he became such a threat that he was publicly assassinated. And that is, of course, I'm not encouraging anybody to get assassinated, but I am encouraging, if you want to make an effect, this is how you do it. Not by being a lone voice crying in the wilderness, but it's by building coalitions, because otherwise you're not going to get anything done. It's hopeless if that's all you're going to do. Stop believing the movies that tell you have to wait on the one to come and change the world. Well, you are the one that's going to help get this stuff off the ground. And you'll need people behind you. You'll need at least a small percentage of people behind you, which can be done by building these coalitions. And it's relatively simple, although dealing with egos and dealing with other issues can be what makes it difficult. But for those of you who are listening, I'm asking you again to start putting down on paper the demands, right? And we are going to be discussing those demands here on this show in the coming weeks. That's going to be a very important part of this program in the next year of 2016. We're going to be talking about demands. We're going to be talking about the way forward and what we want to see, because these next few years are extremely critical, not just to American society, but to the world as a whole. And again, we've got to start uniting one another and bringing one another together. And you would be the go-between as this coalition builder. Remember that. These groups don't have to work with each other. They just have to work with you. And that's why it's so important that you do this. And again, since I've talked about it at the beginning of the year, I've already had some positive response. We've already seen some individuals actually doing this to go out and try to build a coalition with people who have vastly different views of the world than they do, and it's working. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to cooperate, even in 2016, even in the times that we're in, the heavily divided times that we're in. You'd be surprised at how many people are indeed willing to cooperate and maybe aren't as unreasonable as they may sound or be presented to sound, either in the media or through word of mouth. So please get involved with that. We'll talk more about the specific demands in the next few weeks here on this show. We'll go through economic demands. We'll go through other kind of social demands as well, and we'll go through the demands in the shotgun method. Right? We'll spend the whole show talking about what we want in terms of the society that we want to see going forward. Now, until next week, we'll leave that be. But I want to mention what's happening now in Libya. Right? We've got the facade of democracy promotion and freedom promotion in Libya starting to crack a bit for anybody who's paying a small amount of attention. And in this case, we've got an announcement coming from England or from the UK that there will be a deployment of a joint British-Italian force consisting of 6,000 soldiers heading to Libya under the guise of defeating ISIS. Now, it's estimated that there's around 4,000 ISIS fighters in Libya at the moment, and that they're claiming that these fighters pose a significant threat to the national security of England and Italy and other European nations. And also a number of oil fields in Libya, which we'll mention in a second. But notice, out of this deployment, there's apparently 1,000 British soldiers, and that would mean about 5,000 Italian soldiers. It's interesting to note that these soldiers are heading to Libya, the Italians making up the bulk of them, when Italy was in fact the colonial master of Libya for a long, long time. And this will not be lost on the Libyans. This is not going to be lost on any of us who pay attention to geopolitics and history. What we're seeing is colonialism 3.0, right? This is just the reestablishment of colonialism here in Libya. Now, what we had recently, there were 2 people killed in Libya in Sidra. This is the Sidra oil port. Sidra oil port is located on Libya's Mediterranean coast. There was an attack by the ISIS fighters. There was a suicide bomb first, and then followed by infantry attacks or gun attacks, whatever you want to call it. This is the strategy of ISIS fighters across the world, right? In battle. In battle areas. This is what happens in Syria and Iraq. They storm a base or a town. They start with suicide bombers in a vehicle, and then they follow it up with infantry attacks. So obviously some type of across-the-board basic military strategy has been drilled into the heads of these guys, and that should be relevant into asking who drilled it into their heads. But we've covered that on this show. Of course, it's NATO and the GCC. But in addition to the attack on the Sidra oil port, there was also a rocket that was fired into the oil tank there. It was a 420,000 barrel oil tank. It's a huge fire. So that was damaging to the oil facility. Now, Sidra is about 130 miles east of Sirte, which is Gaddafi's hometown. And of course, ISIS raised its stupid black jihadist flag there. ISIS proper, of course, all the guys who were fighting Gaddafi in 2010 were ISIS. They went by different names. They went by the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, but they're ISIS, right? They're all a bunch of monkeys raping and beheading their way across civilized countries at the behest of NATO and the GCC and Israel, whether they know it or not. Now, Libya has been in chaos, absolute chaos, since Gaddafi was murdered by NATO, sodomized with a bayonet by the terrorist pets of NATO. Libya has been in dire straits, right? They've actually had two governments. There's been one that's the more secular type government called the House of Representatives. It's weaker. It's more ineffectual. National Congress. And this is the one that obviously has the characters like Belhaj and all the other fanatics as well. And they've been fighting one another. On top of that, you've got warlords all across the country. You've got ISIS fighters and jihadists all across the country fighting one another, setting up their own local governments. It's absolute hell. And these governments fighting against each other as well. So the governments have actually requested help, allegedly, by Britain. Not requested help, but they were offered help by Britain, meaning they were offered soldiers to come in and help deal with the situation that they created. But Britain said that in order to do that, they must form a unity government. Now, they did. They formed a unity government. Another convenient coincidence. Britain wants a unity government before it can help bring the situation down in terms of violence and chaos. And that's what happens, right? They get a unity government. And now Britain has announced that it's going to be sending troops. Convenient coincidence. So, again, 1,000 British troops, 5,000 Italian ones. We've got to mention the attack on the oil facility there. That's Sidra's oil depot, right? It's been out of action for much of the past year because of the chaos that's taken place in Libya. But if ISIS were to capture it, that would not only help, it could help fund itself, but it would also require some finagling in terms of how oil is actually transferred, right? Now, I'll get into that in a second, but notice that with the deployment of Italian and British troops to Libya in order to fight ISIS, right? The main thing that happened that drew the ire of the British and the Italians allegedly was this attack on the Sidra oil port. So essentially troops are going to go into that area and make sure that oil port is not seized by ISIS, right? Problem, reaction, solution. ISIS wants to seize an oil port. We don't want ISIS to seize an oil port because it funds itself partially through oil. So what do? We send troops in to protect the oil port. Now what does that do if troops go in to protect the oil port? It gives Italy, it gives Britain, essentially Europe or NATO, a Mediterranean oil port, right? It gives them an oil port. And why is that important? Because the Russians are the major provider of oil and gas to Europe. It's constantly a threat to Europe that if they continue to poke the Russians will cut off the spigots. And if they cut off the spigots to Europe, it's going to get very cold very fast. And in addition, this is one of the reasons they wanted a Qatari oil pipeline coming up from Qatar and into Syria and all up to Europe. They wanted that so bad because they wanted to have a bit of leverage against the Russians. Yeah, you go ahead and cut off the spigot. Well, we'll just open the spigot wider from Qatar. Well, that Qatari oil pipeline didn't work because Assad nixed it in favor of the Iranian deal, which would have actually, the Europeans would have been beholden to the Iranians and the Russians. So you could cut off the spigots there and we'll go to Iran, but Iran's probably going to follow suit with the Russians and cut off the spigots, also leaving Britain, again, very cold. So what this does now is allows the Europeans access to a Libyan oil port in the Mediterranean, which is the beginning, of course, of a backdoor method to seize more oil and get leverage over the Russians and the Iranians and that sort of thing. So again, neo-colonialism yet again, but also geostrategic positioning. That's fairly obvious. Now, we'll try to come back to the foreign policy segment of it soon and talk about the Syrian situation. But there's two things in the news that I want to comment on, and that's something that virtually everybody's been talking about. And this first, let's start with the Obama gun control proposal. Now, let's get to the speech first. This pathetic, embarrassing, ridiculously fake speech. Obama is starting to make a run for the record of the most of the weepiest American presidents, second only behind Father George Bush, Poppy George Bush. Remember the man who broke down in the Congress because he wanted a plan to go through, and he just weeps and cries. The leader of the most powerful country on the face of the earth, weeping like a little girl because he doesn't get his way. In Russia, the Western press constantly makes fun of Putin for going out and doing uber masculine things, karate, riding horsebacks with no shirt on, and being muscular and swimming through icy rivers and that sort of thing, while our president cries like a little girl. How about that? Obviously Putin is involved in propaganda, photo shoots for his own people. That's clear enough. But it's funny how one culture values masculinity and its men, and another values crying and weeping and weakness in its president. Well, of course, only a certain population, a certain number of the population values that. But masculinity is being attacked in America, where you can only have masculinity if you're watching football or promoting stupid, immoral wars and feeling tough about yourself as a Trump supporter, or some silliness on that side of the aisle, or trying on women's clothes. That's what passes for masculinity now in America. But we won't get onto that rant. Obama crying over first graders as he murders children left and right in Syria. How many children has Obama murdered in Syria? 250,000 dead people in Syria, and he weeps for first graders here. How many people has he murdered in Iraq? How many people has he murdered in Libya, in Pakistan, in Yemen? Come on, are you seriously believing that this guy really cares about children? I've been seeing the memes coming from the leftists, the Democrats, the liberals, saying that Obama is caring. He cares so much about children. He's fed up. Well, it's a joke. I can't believe you fell for this. This guy's cried 3 times now, and it's been fake 3 times. You know how to make Obama cry? Don't clap for him. He's a narcissist. That's the only way you can make him cry. There were reports that he put a raw onion on his podium. I'm not sure about all that, but there is this classic trick of rubbing an irritant on your eye to make fake tears come. Or you can just be a general psychopath and learn how to mimic the emotions of normal humans and cry on cue. So that's probably more along what happened. A good actor he is. The proposal. Let's talk about that, because I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's not a law. It's a type of executive order. Basically, it's a directive. Obama is directing the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the BATFE, to clarify their definitions, or to clarify their own directives, that anyone engaged in the business of selling firearms, even if the seller operates over the internet or at gun shows, that they must get a license and conduct background checks. Obama said, to sum it up, it's not where you do it, but what you do, right? Okay. There's a lot of this circulating about the internet. If you engage in the business of selling firearms on the internet or at gun shows, but you don't obtain a license and subject buyers to background checks, you're going to be federally prosecuted, and they're going up to 5 years in prison and fined up to $250,000 from the White House that gave weapons to the drug gangs in Mexico that resulted in the death of border agents. But hey, if it worked the first time, it should work the second time, right? Gun laws, the highest in the worst in Chicago, but they have one of the worst murder rates in the country. Congratulations on that. We won't go through all those details, but all of that is what those rules mean, and there are many there are further ramifications to this, right? Because even though they clarify these rules to mean anybody engaged in the business of selling firearms, right? Whether it's the internet or at gun shows, of course, if you were engaged in the business of selling firearms, you already have to get a license and conduct background checks if you sell weapons on the internet or at gun shows, right? So the question is, how is this going to be interpreted? Is this going to be interpreted widely to mean that if you make an individual sale, that you're in the business of selling firearms and you need a license and conduct a background check to engage in a private sale? Is that what it means? We don't fully. Obama also is going to, his budget proposal will include funding for an additional 200 ATF agents and investigators. Great. An agency that should not even exist is now getting 200 more agents and investigators. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Why the hell is the government regulating alcohol? Stills here in South Carolina, we had the fanatic Sheriff Matthews seizing a still for the first time in God knows how many decades in the state. A still. Why is there even a government department? Who gives a shit if somebody has a still, right? It's alcohol. People should be able to make alcohol if they want to make their own alcohol without asking government permission. People should be able to sell alcohol without asking government permission. Why is the government worried about alcohol? Tobacco? Why? That shouldn't even be an issue, right? The Bureau of Firearms, we have the right to own firearms. Too bad for the government there, but we have the Second Amendment. Explosives? Believe it or not, there was a time when farmers used to have dynamite and other types of explosives for removing stumps and that type of thing from their property. And we got along fine as a society. But if you're worried about explosives, maybe you can remove the ATF from the Bureau, just have the Bureau of Explosives. But the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms shouldn't even exist. You want to save money in your budget. You libertarians, you want to cut things. Well, let's cut the BATFE for one thing. Let's just get rid of it. Just drop it. Cut it. Get it out of there. We don't need it. Obama's plan will also have the 230 additional FBI staff members to help more efficiently and effectively perform background checks. Yes, because while we opened the borders to immigration from every country in the world, we need more FBI staff members to make sure that law-abiding American citizens don't buy guns without the proper procedures defined by the U.S. government. But hey, if you're from another country, just walk right in across the Mexican border, and we're not worried about that. He's also going to have $500 million to improve mental health services. Okay, if this is he's relating mental health services to gun laws, right? This is the further mental health dictatorship, right? The idea where if somebody goes into a doctor and says, I'm just not feeling great, I'm not happy with my life, I'm a little depressed, bam, you don't have a right to own guns. They come and take them from you. They throw you in a hospital and make you become psychologically evaluated. God forbid if you say you think 9/11 was an inside job, because that is grounds for being committed, because it doesn't work with the generally accepted view of things from people with MDs and PhDs who basically have their head up their ass so far that it comes out the other end. That is what this $500 million is going to do. The improvement of mental health services won't be an improvement at all. It will be the furthering of the mental health and medical dictatorship that's so closely connected to the law enforcement end of things that it's virtually the same thing. Now, just another word. In terms of how this new directive is going to be determined, and who is going to be considered engaged in the business, we could look to Obama's New York Times op-ed on January 8th. Obama said the gun control steps that he was announcing, quote, include making sure that anybody engaged in the business of selling firearms conducts background checks. Okay. end quote. They say the key phrase in that statement is making sure. Well, well, they can say that, but it's also anybody engaged in the business. That's important as well. Now, he didn't set a threshold number of sales in that op-ed to define who should be a licensed dealer, but the White House did note that, quote, quantity and frequency of sales are relevant indicators, end quote. Okay, that's somewhat logical, but the administration said this: even a few transactions, when combined with other evidence, can be sufficient to establish that a person is engaged in the business. For example, courts have upheld convictions for dealing without a license when as few as 2 firearms were sold, or when only 1 or 2 transactions took place, when other factors also were present, end quote. An Associated Press story then goes around and says that other factors include business indicators like, quote, selling weapons in their original packaging and for a profit. There we go. So, yeah, it's clear that private sales are under attack here. That's clear enough. So, because we're in the business of solutions, what is our response? What do we want to see happen? Well, this is what we want to see happen. These new directives coming from the Obama administration must be rejected. So in other words, we oppose these directives coming from the Obama administration. We oppose all gun laws. So our position is this: the Obama gun directives are they're unconstitutional, so they should not be followed. Right? This is the position that we have. They should be retracted. We should have them immediately retracted. And furthermore, the BATFE should be eliminated. Right? We should not have the BATFE. It's pointless. It's worthless. It only prosecutes people for engaging in business that is their right to engage in. So get rid of that. We are in favor of reversing these directives coming from the Obama administration, and we're for the reversal of all gun laws, to be honest. So that is our position, and that's something that we can that's something that we are interested in promoting, our position there. So that bear that in mind when you go out to build these coalitions. That's something also to look at. Now, let's move on to the other newsworthy topic, the question of the Oregon standoff. This is somewhat more nuanced than the gun issue, because there's a lot of factors here. The Oregon standoff, for those of you who for some reason don't know what happened, these ranchers, the Hammonds, were arrested for setting fire to over 100 acres of federal lands. These guys were apparently setting off a controlled burn on their property, which is adjacent to the federal lands. The fire got out of control and burned over 100 acres of the federal lands. They were prosecuted for the damages they caused to the federal lands, and they were prosecuted as essentially terrorists. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, I think of 1994, was what they were charged under. Now, the prosecution argued that these guys were poaching and that they were attempting to cover up their poaching by burning the area, to essentially burn away the evidence, and that either the fire got out of hand or that they were poaching on federal lands. Either way, that's what the prosecution argued. They were convicted by a jury, and they were sentenced to, I believe, 5 years in prison, which is the mandatory minimum sentence for that crime. Another judge commuted that sentence, I believe that was too heavy, and commuted that sentence to, I believe, a maximum of 2 years in prison. These guys spent several months in prison, and I think they were somehow released as a result of the court decision. But another judge ruled that no, they had to serve the mandatory minimum, and is sending them back to prison. So essentially, they went to prison and they served the requisite amount of time that was required from the previous judge's ruling, and another judge overturned the previous judge's ruling. So they're going back to prison. That's the Hammonds. Now, do we have evidence that the Hammonds were indeed poaching? Well, I'm not privy to what happened in the courtroom. I don't know. Maybe they were poaching. Maybe they were not. Do we have evidence that the Hammonds were simply engaging in a controlled burn? Their argument, of course, was that there was a fire already on the federal lands, and that there was due to a lightning strike, and they set a controlled burn to stop that fire, and it did get out of control, but they were successful in stopping the fire on their land. Well, okay, we don't fully know exactly what happened, but we do know that the Hammonds are not terrorists. We know first that, let's say this. If they burned 127 acres of federal land as a result of their controlled burn, then they should be prosecuted, clearly. If it was intentional, they should be prosecuted. If they were poaching, I have no problem with them being sent to prison for poaching. If it was an accident, well, they are required to pay the damages, right? Then they should have been punished. They should have been paying the damages. But prison, if it's an accidental fire, especially prison under the terrorist definition, this is too far, right? This is one could even argue that that maybe even prison was legitimate for the burn. I wouldn't go that far, right? They need to pay the damages, but if it's an accident, if it was legitimately an accident, and that this fire got out of control, well, it's an accident. Let them pay the damages, and this is not worth prison time. I don't support prison time for that, unless they were doing it maliciously. If they were doing it maliciously, maybe, but this is not known. But definitely not terrorists. Now, enter the Bundys. What is being termed an Oregon militia has stormed the BLM building in Oregon. Right, this is an empty building. They stormed this building. Initially, there was a protest. Lots of people showed up for the protest. There were militias there. There were citizens there. There were right-wingers there, conservatives there, nonpartisan people there, townspeople there, and of course the Bundys showed up. And the idea is that this protest, they were going to go throw pennies at the BLM building, and that was going to be a symbol of buying their country back or buying their government back, and then they were going to march home. Well, then some guys started storming the BLM building. They walked past the sheriff, they went in the building, and they say, "This is ours, we're going to occupy it for years. This is essentially a takeover. We're taking our country back." Now, here's where it gets nuanced. The media is promoting this standoff as a militia standoff. Well, to my knowledge, there are no militias involved in this standoff. The militias that attended the protest were caught completely by surprise. The Idaho militia actually stated that they were there for the protest and they were ready to march, and they did march, but they had nothing to do with this, and they were actually surprised when the guys started going into the BLM building. So what's being termed a militia is actually a group of individuals led by the Bundys. It's not a militia. They don't have their own militia. It's just a group of guys, apparently with guns. So the mainstream media will call them a militia because it's perfect timing to attack the militia movement, right? Because they're still somewhat worried about the militia movement and people who want their Second Amendments and might actually stand up and fight, although they've given every indication that they won't do that. But now the Bundys. First of all, the Hammonds have asked the Bundys to leave. They say they didn't even want them there. That's interesting. But the Bundys, let me state before I get into the Bundys, if these guys made a mistake and burned federal land and were prosecuted as terrorists and are being sent to prison, that's unreasonable. And I don't have a problem, not only with the march, I don't even necessarily have a problem with the method. But the Bundy involvement, that is questionable. Oh God, that is questionable, because the Bundys are con men. Remember the Bundy incident, the BLM incident in Nevada that got all the alternative media going crazy, going out to support Cliven Bundy, or Cloven Bundy as we'll call him. It was a total con. The guy had no legal right to that land. It was a joke. The alternative media has a whole hell of a lot of egg on its face as a result of that. The Bundys are not to be trusted. I don't trust them. I want nothing to do with them. I would not ever engage in any type of protest movement with the Bundys leading that. So if anybody followed the Bundys into these buildings, well, sorry to hear that, guys. You really got yourself in a lot of trouble. Now, that aside, look at the timing. When did this happen? Right before Barack Obama gives his tearful speech about gun control. Right before this speech takes place, we have a bunch of right-wing, gun-toting white guys taking over a government building at gunpoint. And nothing happens. That's the other thing I would point out. Had this been a legitimate protest, right? Had this really been the Idaho militia doing this, what do you think would have happened? We'd have probably called BATFE. We would call the SWAT teams, the FBI. They would have went in with guns blazing. They would have massacred all those people, probably dragged their families out of their homes. They would have gone in with tanks. They would have sent in, they would have burned the place down with them in it. Waco, remember Waco? They would have done that. Suppose it was some black group who did the same thing. Not Black Lives Matter, because they can get away with anything because they're funded by Soros. But I mean, some black militia. Suppose they had done that. What would have happened? The same thing. We would have sent in SWAT teams who would have burned them to the ground, and that would have been broadcast on TV. But these guys just standing there and they get snacks sent in. Nothing happens, and it's conveniently timed for the speech. The gun speech, right? Because as Obama's talking about these heartless killers who resemble him more than anybody else, who kill these children, you've got an armed standoff in Oregon with these crazy Bundys. So I would encourage people not to fall for the Bundy crap again. Not to fall for this. It's great to stand up when the issue is right, but make sure that the people who are standing behind you are not people with daggers in their hands and people who may indeed be working with what you consider to be the enemy. So I don't want to go too much further on the Bundy issue. The nuance comes for the fact that the issue here, unlike Nevada, where they had absolutely no claim to that land, there was no case. Unlike Nevada, there is a case, from what I can tell, that is just, right? That these men were sentenced to prison when they should not have been. They were unfairly sent back to prison, and that this was overkill to these Hammonds. No problem standing up for them. And at some point, people have to stand up and really straighten up their backs and mean it. But I don't trust the Bundys, and I won't be participating in this Oregon standoff in any way and supporting it or anything, because, simply put, these guys aren't to be trusted. Now, for the For the people who are listening, I would say Mark Baker in Michigan, the guy who was harassed for years and years and years with the government agencies who were constantly trying to harass him over his hogs. He's done. Now, he's hanging up his hat. He's fought these government agencies with minimal support for some time, and he can't do it anymore. It's ruined his life. It's ruined his business. It's ruined his health. It's ruined his personal life, and he's quitting. This was a clear example of government harassment of a citizen, of a businessman, of a farmer. I would ask the alternative media, where the hell were you when this man needed help? You live in Michigan, right? He's from Michigan. They call it Michigan. Where the hell were the militias when Mark Baker needed help? They were nowhere to be found. They didn't have to travel to Nevada. They just had to go down the street. Nobody helped Mark Baker like that. Nobody stood out there with guns and refused to let the inspectors in or refused to let the sheriff's office in. Nobody did any of that like they did for this con man in Nevada. That's my point. At some point, people are going to have to stand up in this country and straighten up their backs. But you got to make sure the issue's right, and you got to make sure that the people that you're standing up with aren't working for the other side. Now, let's move on a bit, because I've rambled about these two issues long enough. I want to get into a scientific issue right now. I want to talk about the world of quantum physics, and I had the opportunity to interview a scientist he's a chemist, he's a biophysicist, he's a philosopher. His name is Francis V. Fernandez, and he has given me these equations for solving a number of different problems. And hopefully I can get this in the next 10 minutes. It's the question of defining, or the source of gravity being defined in quantized ether, right? I would encourage you to go to naturalblaze.com or brandonturbeville.com and look up the article, Did This Scientist Just Discover How the Universe Works? Now, on this show, we support scientific development. We believe that science has been developed to such an extent that we can virtually we can accomplish whatever we need, right? Free energy, clean water, no problem. Just enough funding to get these guys going, and we can get this stuff done. Human progress is truly amazing. That's why we want to support that, and that's why we want to throw this information out there for whoever can take it and use it. But I got to go through some explanation here. Throughout the history of what we call modern physics, scientists have theorized about the existence of dark energy, or ether, which is a substance that, if it exists, basically envelops and fills everything, right? All space, all reality is filled with this stuff, if this is true. So ether has often been theorized to be the substance which is the conduit for the actual life-giving force of the universe. Now, physicists have argued throughout the years about this whole concept, and they've never really reached a consensus regarding whether or not this stuff even exists, much less what its makeup or its nature. The ones who argue in favor of the existence of ether run into the problem of a lack of ability to quantize it. The ones who argue against it run into the problem of the conventional mainstream understanding of physics, which is unable to really account for many aspects of reality, whether it's quantum or physical. Now, there was an unpublished paper entitled Man's Greatest Achievement by Nikola Tesla, and this is what he wrote. He said, "Long ago, mankind recognized that all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance, or tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasha or luminiferous ether, acted upon by the life-giving prana or creative force, calling into existence and never-ending cycles all things and phenomena. The primary substance, thrown into infinitesimal worlds of prodigious velocity, becomes gross matter, the force subsiding, The motion ceases and matter disappears, reverting to the primary substance. End quote. Now, if Francis Fernandez and his equations are correct, we may be at the cusp of a scientific breakthrough that will change the face of the world of physics and the world in which we live. This is because Fernandez now claims that he has in fact quantized the mass of ether. He did this by combining the principles of Einstein's theory of relativity, and I understand, before I get any emails, yes, I understand that Einstein largely plagiarized a lot of his theories, and that a lot of the stuff was given to him, but it's attributed to him, and we got to have a common language for the purposes that I'm trying to discuss. So Fernandez combined the principles of Einstein's theory of relativity, Coulomb's law, and Newton's law. And he says that he was able to find the mass that makes these energies equal, meaning the mass of ether. And he resulted in the figure of 1.859222,909 times 10 to the negative 9th kilograms as the mass of ether. So he calls this Fernandez's law, right? He says ether is the lower pulsate limit of the Planck mass and the electromagnetic radial limit. He also says that he's discovered the dynamic living pulsations of ether, which is, he says B equals 1.380668031 times 10 to the negative 32nd meters. So that's what he's got there. Now, if his calculations are correct, this changes the entire ball game, right? He even states himself that once the mass of ether is known, solving a number of unknowns in the world of physics becomes relatively simple. So it's the question of gravity, the question of relativity, the question of magnetism, and even the question of energy itself becomes answerable if his equations are correct. So he says he went on to solve tens of equations and was able to solve tens of unresolved questions within the field of physics. For instance, the question of gravity and relativity, according to Fernandez, once the mass of ether is known, can be solved. And Fernandez suggests that the equation that I've got in this article does just that, right? The mass of Earth times c squared equals the mass of ether times v squared. That's the equation. And those are the questions. That is essentially the equation that answers these questions. Now, we've got a couple of minutes, so maybe I can go over the questions, but please go read this article and share it. Did this scientist just discover how the universe works? I wrote the article. It's up at BrandonTurbeville.com and naturalblaze.com. So the questions about the problems of gravity are really, well, how should we say? There's a lack of consensus on these principles, right? General relativity describes what we observe at the scale of the solar system, right? It all works well. It all works at that scale, and it's been tested. But the problems come when you look at the universe at a very small or at a very large scale, right? At the turn of the 20th century, general science realized that at very small scales, right, in the realm of the atomic and subatomic particles, the world looked very different from what they'd expected, right? The theory of quantum mechanics grew out of the realization and posed a new challenge. The description of fundamental forces of nature had to be adapted to the quantum mechanical insights, right? They had to be quantized. The problem is that general relativity does not comply with that. Einstein's theory can't be easily quantized. They can't find a quantum counterpart in the same ways they found one for electromagnetism, right? There's a report by Thomas Soteru of the University of Nottingham that says that as well. So in fact, the problem of finding a quantum theory of gravity is so challenging and so important, a lot of people consider it to be the holy grail of modern physics. And this is exactly what Fernandez is claiming that he did. So please go read that article and look at those formulas. If you're a physicist, if you have a physics background, take a look at these formulas, and feel free to email me. feel free to share this article around to anybody who may be interested, but feel free to email me and tell me, yes, everything checks out right, or if you have an opposite opinion, if you look at this and say, no, it's bunk because of this, feel free to send me that too, or just put it in a comment under the article on Natural Blaze. It doesn't matter. Just a couple of other points I want to say about what Fernandez says in this in this article. He says that he argues that the speed which we move, right, the Earth and matter in general is moving, is at the speed of light squared, right? So he says this is what Fernandez says. I have shown that my discovery of 186 ether is the lower pulsate limit of the Planck mass. Planck actually derived an ether mass. The Planck length times the ether constant ratio K yields the Planck mass, hence the Planck mass is an ether mass, okay? I'm just trying to get this out. Matter is at the speed of light squared as seen in the matter of Earth below, and he's talking about the formula that's in the article, and mass is ether mass on the right side of the equation. So he's saying that we're all moving, everything is moving at the speed of light. And that really goes against what mainstream physics would have to say. He even derives above. There's pictures in this article when he says that the ether radius is the lower pulsate limit of the Planck length. He says at the heart of the universe is ether in dynamic pulsate motion by a factor of the inverse hand of God alpha number 137.036. All right, so we know that the mainstream physics community is, of course, going to scoff at his claims, but most mainstream science communities often scoff at what they consider fringe declarations until those fringe declarations become mainstream themselves. So we want to put this out there because we want to get this out. If it's accurate, this will change the ball game, and we want to contribute to scientific progress and scientific development. This is your free energy. This is stuff that Tesla was working on before all of his work got stolen and other work got covered up. There's only been a few people with this type of information out there, and if this is accurate, this is absolutely a game changer. So please circulate this article and send it to scientists. If you know scientists, please send it to them. This is not something by any stretch of the imagination that we want to keep within the alternative media. This should be shared all around. Don't think for a minute that the higher levels of government research, DARPA and so forth, don't already know a lot of this information. I would imagine all of it. But the fact that if this is accurate, if it's been revealed to the individuals here at the level of general society, then we have quite a gift if this is accurate. So please go check it out. And remember, this idea of creating a coalition, this is your goal, right? This is your mission should you choose to accept it. And you've heard the mission, so you've accepted it. Silence is acquiescence. Listening to this show is acquiescence. So you got to go out and help build a coalition. Please get on that. We want to thank everybody who's already involved with doing that. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
The Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnby here on UCY.tv.